Hello, everyone, and welcome to the season finale of Gooey's Dungeon Dive, at least for A Link to the Past. Today, of course, like I have been for all these special season finales, I am joined by Corey Richmond of the Player Power Podcast. How's it going, Corey?
It's going good. I'm here. I'm here again.
Yeah, thanks for joining me for a finale to an incredible game.
Of course. I'm the finale guy. I'm the final dungeon guy.
Yeah, I set them up and you come in and knock them down.
Yeah, exactly.
How's it going? How you doing?
It's going pretty good. Nothing too crazy.
How is the Player Power Podcast going?
It's going good. We by the time this comes out, it will have already been passed, but we just recorded an episode where we predicted who the winners of the Game Awards would be, so that was fun.
All right, what do you think the game of the year is? I haven't gotten that far yet. I was listening to I got halfway through today.
So my game of the year, and you'll hear my spiel once you get there, but I'm going Animal Crossing New Horizons.
Okay, that is really kind of the game of 2020.
That was kind of my justification. I'm not saying it's a better game than the ones it's up against, but I think that's definitely the video game of 2020.
Yeah, there was all these games this year that were like definite kind of big games, and then there was, I think, of a lot of ones that like had mainstream kind of fad popularity, like Fall Guys or Among Us or whatever. But
yep.
Which I don't think those were in the running for Game of the Year, but
No.
I just think of like games that kind of define the cultural, moment of 2020, and yeah, I'm with you there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we'll see. We'll by the time this is out, we'll be in the comments making fun of you if you're wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so anyway, we're wrapping up A Link to the Past, and what a sick game. Is that a surprise to anybody? I don't think so. One way to illustrate, I guess, how much of a step forward this game is by, frankly, looking at our lists. And I mean, we're not like taste makers or anything, but I think it speaks to how good this game is. That like your list in particular, there's not a single game from a previous Zelda game. There's not a dungeon that's above any A Link to the Past dungeon. I think it's fair. Yeah,
I was kind of hoping that maybe there would be one, but I was just being honest with myself. I would rather play any dungeon in A Link to the Past. Like if you put these games right in front of me right now, I would much rather play any dungeon from A Link to the Past than any dungeon from the last two games.
Yeah, that's fair. I had the two final ones from the other game. It's maybe it is a bit more honorary, but at the end of the day, it doesn't fully matter with those. The stakes of those two, by the time we're done with this list, they're not going to be very high up. But I kind of wanted to give them a little bit of love for. I guess we'll kind of see sort of their influence in the dungeon we're talking about today. I would say,
yes,
just in terms of being these final epic dungeons and all. But
yes.
I don't know. I guess with the first two games, we sort of talked about with Legend of Zelda and Adventure of Link. What about the dungeons? There was stuff that like kind of surprised us about them, or not even totally surprised us, but it was like when you kind of took a fine comb to them, or like looked at their design, what was actually interesting about them, and it kind of, there was like a new appreciation for them, like, does that aspect, I don't know if that aspect was here as much. I like just saying, like, I don't know if I was surprised that the dungeons in this game were cool.
Yeah.
What do you think? Were you surprised by anything?
No, because A Link to the Past is one of my favorite Zelda games, so I've played these dungeons many times. I've known for a while that these are some pretty sick dungeons. But there is some this game, in its dungeons in particular, does introduce a lot of concepts that we see carried throughout the dungeons in the rest of the series from this point onwards. So in that way, it is kind of like the other games. Legend of Zelda introduced some stuff that carried on. Adventure of Link introduced some stuff, and now A Link to the Past really just kicked down the door, and it's like this is really like a framework of kind of what dungeons moving forward are going to be like for the most part.
Yeah, and I think you really, you see it throughout the whole game. You see it setting that up. I think of early game, you kind of have these first 3 dungeons. I think of the Light World dungeons, you can kind of compare them to the Child dungeons in Ocarina of Time. They're challenging and stuff like that, but when you compare them to the later dungeons of the game, they're way more simplistic.
Yeah.
And then you can find in all of these various dungeons elements that were surprisingly carried over in ways that sometimes it doesn't get credit for, but what can you do?
Yeah, exactly. And then in some ways too, just functionally, this game, with the other 2 games, a lot of times we kind of had to come up with our own headcanon for what makes this dungeon special, or come up with our own, thematics around it. But with A Link to the Past, this is the one where really, both aesthetically and functionally, gameplay and layout wise, these dungeons are very unique from each other. They have things.
Yeah, totally.
They have things, in their design, both visual and, the layout of the actual map, where it's this dungeon functions totally different than this one, and this one's totally different than this one.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think this game still has just some of the correct amount of mystery to it. Some of the dungeons, it's very clear, this is the ice palace or whatever. But then I loved, one thing I loved about going through these was finding all these quotes, from the Nintendo Player's Guide that are up on the Zelda Dungeon Wiki, that for a place I don't know, Desert Palace or Eastern Palace, these interesting quotes and stuff that was kind of headcanon-y more than anything. It's not official lore or anything, but I like that they had a little bit of both. And I always love the kind of filling in some of the gaps in certain Zelda games, filling in some of that lore.
Yeah, definitely.
But then, this did have clear thematic dungeons with particular stories to tell.
Yeah. Well, just in that regard too, with the lore behind the dungeons, it's crazy to think that in the first 2, the palaces and the dungeons are kind of just, you can come up with your own headcanon for them, but really they're basically just video game levels that are hidden in the overworld for you to complete. But this game is really what started making the dungeons feel like actual locations in the A Link to the Past world, as opposed to just, here's the next level. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, they are functionally, in a lore sense, they are, the palaces in this, in the Dark World or whatever, are similar to, the palaces in Adventure of Link, but yeah, they do a much better job of kind of grounding it in the world. So looking at your list, are there any that I don't know, that you really were surprised by, where you were I don't like this one, but then it found its way higher on your list or something like that?
So there were, let's see, Ice Palace is one that I actually just said something in the Discord today about this. I used to hate Ice Palace, and I feel like a lot of people used to hate Ice Palace. But now that, the difficulty curve is kind of not as much of an issue, and I can appreciate the layout of it, I ended up putting Ice Palace pretty high. It's at my number 3 right now. And then one that you really like, I think it's up towards your top right now, is Misery Mire. And that's one that, even in all of my time playing A Link to the Past, and A Link to the Past was one of my first Zelda games, Misery Mire has always been, to me, one of the most forgettable dungeons in the game. I don't know if that's because of the order in which I did the dungeons, or just, I don't know if it's elements of that dungeon itself, but on this playthrough, and especially on, looking at it more in depth and looking at the map and looking at the different things that I thought were cool about it, I ended up putting it a lot higher than I expected. I put it at number 4, above Swamp Palace.
Yeah, that's pretty good placing.
Yeah.
Was there anything like, you got like a top 3 here. Like what did you value most? Did you have anything about these specific dungeons that were at your top that were like made them the best, or is it just like you just happen to like these 3?
So the top 2, I was just mentioning before about how this game does a good job of making the dungeons feel like they're actual locations in the world of A Link to the Past. And I feel like these 2 dungeons at the top, Skull Woods and Thieves Town, they have this in spades. Like, these thematically feel like they belong in the world so well. And they both have their own little, aside from being thematically very strong and feeling in place in the world, they both have their own sort of functional gimmicks, which I think lend themselves to exploration in these dungeons really well, especially in Skull Woods. Like, the idea of incorporating it into the overworld, I feel like that's such a novel concept that we haven't really seen that in another Zelda game, except for maybe, Skull Woods and A Link Between Worlds. But even that one, it's not really the same.
Yeah, no, it's definitely different, because the navigation element isn't there. You're not navigating the overworld necessarily. It's a choice of like, do I fall in this hole or that hole? And
exactly.
Either one's not really a wrong answer. I guess it isn't in Skull Woods in A Link to the Past either, but like you can access this different parts of the underworld through the overworld.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have that choice.
Even in A Link Between Worlds, a lot of the optional holes and stuff literally just land you on like a platform which has an optional chest or something. And then you just jump down into where the other hole would have brought you. But in this variation of Skull Woods, there are something like 5 or 6 different entry points into the dungeon, and it just plops you right into a random room of the dungeon, not to reward you, but just like, here, you're in it now. Figure out where you are.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, I agree that this game really sets up kind of the thematic dungeon element for sure. Like, I valued that a lot too. And I think the two you have up top too, they also kind of, not that the formula has not even really been fully established with like how dungeons work. I think that comes maybe with Link's Awakening a little bit more, but like these 2, Skullwoods and Thieves Town, don't have kind of the more traditional like, okay, you find the map and compass, and then you find a couple keys.
Yeah.
And then you find like the dungeon item, which allows you to progress, and then you get like the big key, or in this game, I guess you get the big key before because you need it for the item typically.
Yeah.
But like, I just think about, I think I mentioned it a couple times about like this game changes up a lot, like where you actually use the big key.
Yeah.
And I think these are both examples of like Thieves Town is like they just give you all that stuff right away. Skull Woods, it's like you gotta fall in all these holes, and you could totally just not even fall in the holes that have the map or compass. I think this game does a really good job of that.
Thieves Town's item, it's so interesting because it's like, it's literally just off in a corner of the basement. You don't need it to complete the dungeon.
You could miss it. I think some people might not like that, but
So I actually, just on a little side tangent, I remember, I know you said how Thieves Town, the layout seems almost like random. Not really random, but kind of like there's not a lot of thought behind it in terms of progression. And I did feel that way at first, but then I I saw that picture in your video of how the light shining through the buildings in the overworld, that's the same as the rooms in the dungeon.
That's so cool.
That blew my mind. But then I started thinking about the dungeon as if, what if this wasn't designed as a video game level? This is literally designed as like a thieves' town. And I started thinking about it that way. And it's like that the entry section where it's 4 big rooms and a bunch of like, overpasses and like paths going under, that's almost like the town right there and like the roads where they were probably going all around and talking to each other. And then you have the room in the upper right, which is where you end up fighting Blind. Before, according to the lore, this is basically Blind's hideout, and when he wasn't in hiding, I don't think it's a stretch to say that was maybe like his room or his like throne room of sorts. And then if you go to the left, you go downstairs, and that's where you basically find the dungeons where they would keep prisoners. And like the rooms on the left are all just filled with like, it's got the treasure in the bottom left, so it's like that makes sense where that's where they would keep a valuable item just hidden in the basement in the corner. And then the top left room is like basically just a pit that you get locked in. So that could just be where they kill people.
Oh my god.
Well, that's why I started coming up with headcanon for why the layout was like that, and once I did that, I was like, this is actually pretty sick.
I like that stuff, and I guess to go with what you're saying too, if this first area is like the Thieves' Town, that's why I like the rest of the dungeon is locked behind the big key, like right there, and you get it right away, because like now you're just entering the hideout,
Yeah, exactly.
But I was mostly just kind of thinking of that like first area with the 4 rooms. It just seemed goofy to me.
Well, it's like you just said, that's like the common area for the thieves, but then the important people get to go in the back.
Yeah, okay, I like that. Yeah, it works for me. Actually, I think the thing that was holding me back with it is just how, like, there's a little bit of limitations there in, like, me picturing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't look like that.
Sure, yeah.
But whereas, like, the upstairs portion of the dungeon actually looks like when you go into, like, the Blind's hideout in the Light World in Kakariko Village. Like, It just looks like the inside of a building with, like, tables and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But, like, it's a bit more abstract and, like, video gamey in that basement, because they, like, you could do that now, and you could probably have it look like more like an actual hideout common room.
That's something, too, that I notice is that in the dungeon room where there's the cells where you find Blind disguised as one of the maidens, there's literally just a random, like, picnic table right there outside of the cells. And I saw that and I was like, that's so cool. There's no reason for that to be there other than, hey, this is where the thieves hang out when they're guarding the prisoners.
Yeah. And so I think they wanted, like, that first area to be, like, more puzzly. And so, like, they... And I do, like, kind of just, like, jumping on the platforms and stuff like that. But, like, I guess I would have just been satisfied if it was, like, a room with, some tables and, like, random stuff set up like that. And it was less... Like, it does... I just don't think the dungeon needs to be as puzzly as it is, you know?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. But I still like it a lot. I mean, I had it pretty well. I guess I have it at number 8 currently. So
brutal.
You kind of see where I sort of valued what kind of dungeons I liked with the top 2 of mine are some a bit more of the puzzly ones. And I think it's because they kind of remind me of Palace of Darkness and Misery Mire. They kind of remind me of like the Link's Awakening dungeons. Because they're just like so much more like a lot of them are more non-linear. You can kind of grab a bunch of different keys, and that's just something I love to do. I think I described it in like the Misery Mire version, but I always love in like Link's Awakening, like just like I love that like mapping process of like, okay, what's in this room? Okay, it's a locked door. I'll remember to come back here, or
Yeah.
oh, I need this item, I'll remember to come back here. And one thing I love to do is like try to see how many keys can I get before I even open up any door, and like try to remember where all those doors are. And that's like, I don't know, that's just such a satisfying element of Zelda games to me. So I always value those kind of dungeons a lot, where it's like it's a bit more puzzly, even if it's like a little bit less thematic,
Yep. You have to slowly unlock your way towards the final points
like,
of the dungeon. I get that.
Like you're picking a knot or something like that.
Yeah.
But
I do like that too. I tend to like dungeons like that more when it's in 3D Zelda games, when you can more kind of like if there's an instance where you get to a spot where you have to return to, I tend to like that more in 3D games because I can visualize where I need to get back to better.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have that problem as much, though it's a bit harder. It's a bit harder with like a ton of floors, but A Link to the Past, it's never too complicated. Like they do a good job of like any of the dungeons that are like towers.
Yeah.
That's not the part that has like a lot of keys or anything.
I'm a sucker for a good tower.
I do like the towers.
Yeah.
But I think an important thing about A Link to the Past is that it has a variety. If the game was all Misery Mires, like I don't know if I'd like it as much.
Yeah. That goes back to what I was saying before, where it's like this game has so many different dungeons that just function differently. There are ones where it's like a puzzle box where you gotta like slowly find your way to the end point. There are towers where it's pretty much just a linear ascent. There are linear ones, there are non-linear ones, there are ones where you have to go into the overworld, there are ones that are just totally thematic and don't really have a lot of thought to the design. That's what I think is really cool about what this game introduces.
Yeah, definitely, especially compared to the last two games. Yeah. I think most Zelda games take great care to kind of follow that from here on out. Though there's some edge cases in different directions where some focus on, they value different things, which is, you do what you got to do, I guess, for your game.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So we might as well then transition into talking about the final dungeon, Ganon's Tower. And so a big theme of this that I was thinking about, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, is actually how much this game introduces that just becomes a staple of the Zelda series. And Ganon's Tower is a great example of that in like many different areas of it. In particular, I think about just how much, like, it's kind of cliche to say, but like how much Ocarina of Time is just a 3D remake of A Link to the Past.
Yeah.
I think Ganon's Tower is like the best example of that.
Yeah. Definitely.
It starts all the way with, I mean, just the concept of the game, right? But it leads you to Ganon's Tower, where you're trying to like break the seal on it by, after you've freed the 7 sages or whatever, and you have this pretty awesome cutscene of Link kind of, magically, breaking the seal of the tower so he can enter it. And I guess we'll talk about it more in Ocarina of Time, but it's like, wow.
Yeah.
I love it because, as someone who I played this game a little bit as a kid, but was like kind of too young to get into it. So now it's like I've always come back to it, as more of a fan of Ocarina of Time or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just always kind of like excites me when I like, that's a more obvious element, but there's more subtle things that I pick up every time that I'm like, oh, of course, this was introduced here,
Yeah. Yeah, that's I personally, I didn't play this. See, in my, the era of my life where I really started getting into video games was probably like the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. That's when I was old enough where I could pick the games I wanted to play. I was completely forming new memories with them, playing them totally by myself and figuring it out by myself. And I actually didn't have the SNES version of this game. I had the Game Boy Advance remaster.
Oh,
so
nice.
that's why this was one of my first Zelda games. So when I look at the stuff Ocarina of Time did, I didn't play Ocarina of Time till much later. So I see that and I'm like, oh, that's kind of like A Link to the Past.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I like that twist on it. I never, you know what? That reminds me. I want to apologize because we are not talking about Palace of the Four Sword. I think it is the bonus dungeon in that game.
Yeah, whatever.
Because I've never played that version and I didn't play it this time. But you know, maybe one day we'll go back to it.
It's nothing too special.
Okay, good. I've never even like looked at it before,
yeah.
So yeah, but Ganon's Tower, I think it's kind of cool because it does remind me a lot of like Hyrule Castle from earlier in the game, in that it almost has like two sections of the dungeon. Do you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. That's the thing. I ended up ranking Hyrule Castle lower than you, but I do feel like if the sections of Hyrule Castle were kind of done in succession rather than split apart, it would be a little more effective. And this is this kind of delivers on that. It's like you get that basement all over the place section, and then immediately after you get the ascent of the tower leading to the final boss.
Yeah. I think it's a good... I like it. I like how it's paced throughout the game, where you kind of have that basement in the beginning, and then you have the tower in the middle, and then it's like, here's this uber castle at the end. Like, I like his castle almost kind of mirrors Hyrule Castle, which is like the theme of the game, you know, almost like the mirror world, the dark mirror world element, you know, even though it's not like the same location, it's not like explicitly said. I mean, this is literally also a concept in Ocarina of Time where, you know, the final dungeon is just where Hyrule Castle was.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a dark version of it. But yeah, this basement area it's pretty awesome, actually.
Yeah.
This reminds me a little bit more of Death Mountain, or even like the Great Palace, where it is just kind of, especially like with it looks like Death Mountain, but I think it plays more like the Great Palace, where you just kind of have these two like long linear sections that you can kind of go down.
Yeah, and they both pretty much lead to you stole the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Oh, really? I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, they both pretty much lead, exactly to where you need to go. And there's all the stuff down there that you can collect, but it's pretty much optional. Like, there's like the map and the compass, all these extra keys because you don't need to go both ways, you know. Mm-hmm. There's the red mail, which is down there, which is, I mean, that's good to me. That's a perfectly fine final dungeon item.
Yeah, that's great. That's especially great to get right before you go up that brutal ascent of the tower.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, for a first-time player, you definitely would need this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and it's a little bit more puzzly, I would say, this area. There's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of standout puzzles down here, I think. Was there any that kind of stuck out to you?
Honestly, I'm looking at the map right now, and it's like you look at each room, and it's like every other one has, its own unique puzzle, its own unique element to it. I like. Yeah. There's there's like that warp maze.
Yeah, that's pretty fun. Yeah.
And then there's the big central room that both paths lead you to, where I
love that room. Yeah,
where you can see. And something that I didn't notice until a more recent playthrough is that the area where you have to go to progress in the dungeon is marked with Triforces on either sides of the door.
Yes, yeah, it's very cool.
I think that's so cool. So you see that door over there, and you're like, wait a minute, there's no path. What do I do? But there's a torch that you can light, and it lights up the path briefly.
There's actually, and I think it's cool because there's like 3 different ways you can approach this invisible path. There's like, lighting the torch is the only good way, but I like that there's kind of the option of like, I see some people, or like I think even in like the guide they say like you could use the Cane of Samaria to like push a block and see where there's ground to stand on.
That would take a while.
Like, yeah, I'm like, okay, fine. Or you can use the ether, which will kind of make it appear.
Lights it up briefly. And then you can, there's enemies on it too, so you can see, you could just feel it out too and just kind of.
You could, yeah. That'd be a pain in the butt, but.
Yeah.
I like too that if you don't go the way you need to go and you go to the door to the left, I think it is, right? That's where like the chest is that you need the key for.
So then that's where that is.
But if you go back up, it spits you back into the like first room, and it's a one-way door, so you have to like make your way all the way back around again.
Yep.
I kind of like that, actually.
I like that too. That's something that was also kind of in Ice Palace that I like, where it's like if you go down one path, like you push a block and it spits you right back out towards like the beginning of where it forked, and it's like, okay, now I know this way ends up with me there. Now I got to try something else.
I like it too because you could be like, okay, I need to go back to that room and kind of trudge all the way back, or like there's this other route you could take.
Yeah.
That if you're playing for the first time, you have no idea what's down that way. And in both routes, they give you enough keys and stuff to ensure you can get through just that side.
Yeah, exactly.
So like, yeah, it basically opens up a whole, it reminds me a little bit of Misery Mire, where it's like, wherever I end up, it's like, you could just like keep exploring and you usually find something new, like a new key to collect, or like the map or the compass or the mail, you know?
They spread them out pretty evenly so that if you find your way going down a certain path, you never really feel like I'm expending all of my keys with nothing in return, because usually you'll find keys along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And this section also has, I mean, the whole dungeon has this, but the first time you encounter it is down here, which is fighting, I think you fight the Armos Knights down here.
Yeah.
You fight all the Light World dungeon bosses throughout this dungeon.
That's something I love about this too. Just all those 3 bosses from 3 different dungeons, you got to fight them all in one dungeon now.
And I think it's appropriate that it's just the Light World dungeons. I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
You haven't seen him in a while, so it's not like, oh, this guy again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess Moldorm is kind of annoying, right? So that can be a little bit like,
yeah,
oh, this guy again.
But it's not just, I love that it's also not just a copy and paste either. Like, because the Armos Knights, now you're on ice. It bumps up the difficulty level. Lanmola, now you have one of those statues that's shooting fireballs at you in the room.
Totally.
And then with Moldorm, it's just a totally different shaped battlefield that's kind of bottlenecks in the middle, which could lead for some, a little bit more difficulty. You kind of have to think about where you are a little bit more.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the best versions of doing that.
Yeah, definitely.
Which I think a lot of aspects that this game does, like, this is just my personal opinion, but I feel like a lot of things it does that later games copy, even games that I like more than it, I feel like they don't do it as good as this game. Yeah. But sometimes you nail it on the first time, I guess.
Yep.
So yeah, you got the basement floor, but then, like we were saying, you have this whole other second part of the dungeon after you can go up, and it does become more of this, it's linear, and it becomes a little bit more combat focused, or even like traversal focused. Like, there's some rooms that just give you a pain in the butt to try to get through, to like even walk through, but I would say it's definitely less puzzly.
Yeah,
it's more like fight the enemies.
Exactly. It's it's kind of just like a straight up gauntlet, climbing all the way up to the top, and that's a concept for dungeons that sometimes are used just by themselves. There are dungeons in the future where it's pretty much just that. It's pretty much just like a linear pathway, and you kind of just have to slog your way through.
Yeah, which I like. I like that in its own, but I like that this has both, because it's meant to kind of feel like this final challenge, and it builds up the hype,
Definitely, big time. And that's something, that's what I said before. I'm a sucker for a good tower. Cause it's like, I love dungeons that are very puzzle boxy and they make you really, really think about the navigation. But then I also love, thrown in with that, it's just hype dungeons where you're just climbing to the top. You don't really have to think about where you're going, but you really have to think about how you're playing.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, if you just try to take a lot of these enemies like brute force, it's probably bad. Or like there's rooms where it's just like they'll have like moving platforms or like ice to slip on. I'm pretty sure.
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, you don't want to just try to run through that. You want to be more strategic.
Yeah, there are so many spikes in this ascent.
Yeah, a lot of spike rooms for sure.
Very dangerous.
But yeah,
a lot of conveyor belts, a lot of ice, a lot of spikes.
Are there the fire bars? I'm pretty sure that has to be in there.
Yep.
Totally. Okay. Yeah. So this is, I mean, and
there's cannons, there's laser eyes, there's invisible floors.
There's a lot of goofy stuff in this game, which I kind of love. I don't think people give this game enough credit for being as weird as it is actually.
Exactly.
But yeah, this concept, I feel like we'll see it again, like in Ocarina of Time, where it's like you have that final ascent up to the final boss, and making it linear and stuff like that does kind of build that tension, because again, you're not confused. You're more anxious than anything, I guess I would say.
Yep. And something that I love is that they continue that small design choice of having the way forward, the doors surrounded by these big green Triforces on either side. It just reminds you, I'm going the right way, and I just have to keep going.
It's like, this is what you're fighting for.
Exactly.
And then, okay, yeah, you get up to the top, and of course, you got another Aghanim fight, but it's different enough this time.
Yep.
And it's pretty epic. I'm pretty sure there's like lightning or something in the background.
Yep.
I don't actually remember, but
there is. Yeah.
Aghanim fight is pretty cool. I'm not totally like in love with the Aghanim fight, but it's the the whole tennis or whatever. It's come back so much, so
yeah,
it kind of has that legacy.
Well, I mean, even that's thing. Another thing where it's like, if you didn't play this game early on, you get up here and you're like, oh, it's tennis again. But this was the game that introduced that. So this is really only the second time.
Yeah, and it has been quite like, kind of like with the Light World bosses. It's been a long enough gap. Like, I don't mind reusing bosses like that.
Yeah.
In a game, if it's not egregious, and they're not like, it doesn't take like 20 minutes to fight these guys or anything.
Yep. But even in this, even Aghanim, even if you don't really like that fight, they still take the time to put in a little bit, just twist it a little bit so that it's harder. Because now he has clones of himself, 2 clones that pop out and also shoot, the blue balls at you.
Yeah, and you got to be strategic to avoid those and also reflect. It's definitely better. I like it more than the original one, because I find with the original, the first fight, it is a little bit more of like kind of waiting for him to move and then shoot the ball and like, oh, dodge is the wrong thing. Whereas this is like, you always got to be dodging for the most part. Yeah, and you got to be a little bit more strategic. So it's a great evolution of the last fight for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
You technically go to a new location, right?
Yep.
But I think for the purposes of this is essentially part of the dungeon, wouldn't you say?
Pretty much. Well, even flying you, that whole sequence where, Ganon comes out of Aghanim and turns into a bat and flies away, and then you call your little bird friend and you fly away after him, and
that's pretty epic.
Ganon crashes into the top of the pyramid. That's so cool. And
yeah, it looks so sick.
It does something that I'm trying to think of other games that do it this way. I know Skyward Sword is one. It opens up the door, shall we say, to the final boss, but it gives you the freedom to go do final preparations beforehand. And I kind of prefer it that way, I think, because it gives it a sense of like, this is so big time. This is going to be such a serious fight that you got to go prepare.
I think it was a really smart choice in this game, actually, because for some people, I'm sure you would really want to do it, where I feel like it's less, and I don't mean to diss anyone if you're having a hard time in like Ocarina of Time, but I feel like it's a lot less necessary to like have to leave and come back,
Yep, definitely.
Whereas this is like, even if you're good, I think even if you're good at the game, like, you want to be prepared for this fight,
Yeah, Ganon's hard. And yeah, especially after, assuming you got through all of Ganon's tower in one run without having to leave and do something else, which is an impressive feat on its own, especially for a beginning player. Having to fight Ganon immediately after would be pretty dang difficult.
Yeah. And especially if you don't have like the silver arrows, because it's not
definitely
like part of the quest. It's actually kind of a side quest almost. Like, characters tell you about it and like tell you need it, but like it's not like, you don't have like a scene where like Zelda shows up and like, here's the arrows you need to beat him, or like it's not the dungeon item, it's the red mail. So but I guess, I mean, you could beat him without the silver arrows.
Yeah, there is a way to do it. I've never pulled it off.
Yeah, I don't know what it is either. So, I mean, it's definitely a bit trickier of an item to get.
It's like, like the way to beat him without, you have to like, so you go through the first two phases where like it's all in the light, and then he's like, oh, I'm going to turn the lights off or whatever. And if you light one of the torches before both of them go out and you continually light it, then he never does like the disappearing, or what is it? If you do that, it basically makes it so that you can just spin attack him a bunch of times and eventually he will die.
Okay, this does not sound intended.
No, definitely not.
Okay, so it's for all purposes, this is a required item.
Yeah,
that they don't explicitly give to you. So some people might not like that, but there's plenty of hints for it. So
yeah,
but yeah, I guess that could be considered a flaw with this final fight. But overall, I actually think this is one of my favorite final bosses, actually. I don't know how you feel about this fight.
Yeah, I love it. I love dropping into the final battle room. I love the multiple phases. I love the music.
He's like, on guard, which is sick.
Yeah, he's got some cool dialogue.
The phases are cool. I think it is annoying if you fall off and have to backtrack and kind of go through the whole thing again. But I don't think they needed to do that. Like, you could have just spawned back there with some, I guess if you want to like bail on the fight, that's cool.
Yeah, but I don't really mind it too much. I don't know. I feel like because it's the final boss, it's like just adding that extra layer of difficulty. Like, I don't really mind that. Whereas with Moldorm, the boss of the third dungeon, it's kind of like, okay, why couldn't
Come
this
on, guy.
Why do you got to do that?
But yeah, overall, I really like this fight. I like the first phase of dodging the flame bats, and Ganon just looks cool, and like his attacks look sweet. Like, he makes the ring of fire, and they turn into the bats.
That trident fly at you. That trident is so cool.
Yeah, and like the way he uses that, like this is I love almost all the boss battles in this game. They're more classic. They're definitely more combat focused than like later Zelda games, but I think it's this is like classic video game combat of like, dodging and attacking,
For sure.
But yeah, I love that first phase, and then the second phase, I love that has a bit more of the puzzle element to it, but it's still, you still like dodge the attacks and have to hit them at the right time. can be a bit annoying to have to like pause to change the items or whatever, but it's kind of a nitpick for me.
Mm. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. But overall, I think it's an awesome fight. I personally think it's one of the best final bosses in the series, because it has the factor of it's epic and cool, like he looks sick, but it's also a fun fight, and it's also a challenging fight. Like that's sometimes there's a trade-off. I think of some of the other big final Zelda boss fights are like big and epic, but sometimes they're fun, but they're usually not challenging. I think they're a bit more focused on just like being big and cool.
It really is just kind of that triangle of like fun fight, challenging fight, let's say epic fight. And it's like you always have to lean towards one side and you sacrifice one of the other points, you know?
Mm-hmm. I think Ganon's Tower and the boss, for in all regards, like hit the sweet spot for me. Definitely. Where this is an epic, it's big, it's got these 2 sections, but it's still like a good dungeon with lots of great puzzles and challenges, and it's like 2 dungeons in one, essentially, like 2 mini dungeons in one, I guess, with 2 different concepts. Great final boss, great use of the old bosses. Overall, I think this is it's a phenomenal dungeon
for sure. And just even as a final dungeon, that's something that I really hope for in final dungeons, is that aside from being its own epic thing, it really tests your skill and tests what you've learned in the rest of the game. And just even in this dungeon alone, you know, you're going to be using your bombs, you're using your hook shot, you're using your fire rod, you're using your arrows, you're using the silver arrow on the boss. Like you really have to take everything that you've learned from all of the dungeons and just the rest of the game up to this point and implement it here in this final challenge.
This game overall, I think, has incredible pacing and progression, and not in the way that we normally talk about it in definitive ranking, which is like, is the game boring sometimes? But like, where you have those first 3 dungeons, as well as like Hyrule Castle, which acts as like a tutorial and then sort of a midway checkpoint, almost like a false ending. But anyway, you have that. You have the first 3 dungeons that introduce you to all the puzzle concepts of like the switch puzzles, the warp tiles, all that kind of stuff that are then elaborated on throughout the Dark World dungeons, especially in like Palace of Darkness and the first couple there. And then I think in like from like Ice Palace to Misery Mire, Turtle Rock, and then especially Ganon's Tower, I think you really see a focus on like bringing in all of the items you use, and like I think in those last set of dungeons you're using everything. Yeah, for sure. So I think it really does build off its each previous dungeon in such a way that's, while still like being unique at the same time. Like each dungeon is so unique. Yeah. Well, even aside from just using items, and it just includes a lot of stuff, a lot of elements of the dungeons that you've been in previously, and just throws them in here. Like we said before, one of the only places in the game where you find those icy patches are in Ice Palace. Those are in here. It's got, it's got disappearing floors, which are in, like Dark Palace. It's got the pits that you got to fall into, like in Skull Woods. It's got a bunch of fire traps and fire bars, which you find laser a lot in Turtle Rock and stuff. Yeah, it's really hard to specifically describe the vibe of it. You know what I mean? Yeah, like it's not like, oh, it's a dark castle, Yep. Here's a little food for thought, just building off of that. Uh-oh. A lot of times in future Zelda games, we tend to see the theme of you go to the final dungeon, and aside from it being its own thing, it's segmented into different sections that have their own theme
based on other dungeons. Like take Wind Waker's Ganon's castle, Ganon's tower, or even Ocarina of Times. You go in there, you go down one hallway, and that entire section it's like, oh, this is the fire temple section. It has a lot of stuff that was in the fire temple. And then you go over to the ice section that's got a lot of stuff that you would find in the water temple and the ice cavern and stuff. But with this dungeon, it finds a way to take all of those elements from previous dungeons and just constantly intermix it throughout your entire journey in this dungeon. And I think that's the way that it should be done.
I 100% agree with you. I think it goes back to the triangle you talked about in a different sense. Like this it just hits the sweet spot. I think that's how I would describe it. It has all those elements, but it still manages to be its own unique thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, good. We're in agreement here. We've pre-ranked these other final dungeons. Maybe our thoughts will change when we get to it, though. Mm-hmm. Who knows? This is really not part of the dungeon, but do you have any thoughts of, you beat Ganon, the stairs open up, and then you go talk to the Triforce?
The essence of the Triforce. It really isn't part of the dungeon, but this, I'm sure Mossies would love this as well, this comment, but I think A Link to the Past has one of the coolest and most satisfying and most, like, heartwarming you did it endings of almost all Zelda games. I think it's the best one in a way. I love the whole ending sequence where what happens after you get the Triforce. I love the credits crawl. It's all magical even after you beat Ganon.
It like, to me, it makes a little bit more sense than like in Ocarina of Time, and it doesn't really matter if the final credits make sense.
Yeah,
but I love it because you go there and the Triforce looks sick because it's like 3D or whatever.
Yeah,
but
the twirly
then
thing.
they recap you all the lore that like has been recapped to you like a couple times.
Yeah,
like we get it. I know how this works, but I love that the ending is just they go, so you want to make a wish.
Yeah.
And Link makes a wish, and then the credits are just like all of the. I think it's supposed to be just like Link's wish, like to undo all of the bad stuff.
Everything goes back to the way it was.
Whereas in like Ocarina of Time, it's like, why are there Kokiri at Lon Lon Ranch?
Yeah, everyone's they just threw a party at Lon Lon Ranch.
Like, I thought the Kokiri couldn't leave the forest.
Yeah,
I don't know, but in this it just makes sense. It's like Link wished for everything to be good, and we're gonna take you on a tour of. I mean, some of the stuff I don't know what it's supposed to mean. It's like vultures in the desert.
Vultures rule the desert. Yeah.
Okay, why did Link wish about the vultures in the desert? I don't.
Maybe it's like what are those enemies that look like upper bodies that crawl around in the sand?
The Geldman or something.
Yeah, maybe they like invaded, and before it was just ruled by the vultures. I don't know.
Oh, like the vultures aren't actually that bad.
Yeah, the vultures are just
cranky.
Just creatures that live there, but those guys were like Ganon's minions or something.
Or there's like flippers for sale or something.
Yeah.
It's like, and then the Zoras are like, oh.
That's okay. Cool though. I like that though, because it's like, the Zoras were hostile the whole time, and then at the end of it's like, well, maybe we'll be a little bit nicer. We'll sell these flippers to everyone. Out.
Okay. But I won't let this will not affect my dungeon ranking. The vultures have don't affect it. Okay. So, we can go to our final rankings then. Like we said, on your list here, you have, it's all Link to the Past all the time up top. I can probably guess, but where does this come in for you?
Yeah, this is even before doing a deep dive on this, even before going into A Link to the Past, I knew that this is right at number 1. And full disclosure, this dungeon is going to be at my number 1 for probably a very long time. This is
sweet. Yeah.
Not only is this the best dungeon in this game, this is one of my favorite dungeons, probably top 5 in the entire series.
That's awesome.
I've said before, I said before in both of the previous episodes of this that I've been on, I have kind of a final dungeon bias a little bit. And
you do, yeah.
But this dungeon is entirely what informed that bias. Because
that's a good point. Because I've always been kind of the opposite way. I think of some of the other games, and I think, okay, there's like a good final dungeon in this game, but when I think of like the standouts, like an Ocarina of Time or whatever, it's like, okay, the forest temple stands out way more, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever. Take any game, and it's like there's probably something more interesting going on. Whereas like this, in a way that some of the other final dungeons don't have, it does do exactly what you said, where it ties up all the elements, but it actually is a good final challenge. Kind of like what I was saying with Ganon, where it is challenging. It does tie in all the elements. It's not just a trip down memory lane, you know what I mean? Like remember the forest section, remember the fire section.
Exactly. That's why that's why this dungeon, this being one of my first final dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series, and the fact that it is one of the only ones that hits that sweet spot so perfectly, it really just sets me up to love when, well, it's, I guess, by saying I have a final dungeon bias, that doesn't necessarily mean that I automatically think all final dungeons are better than regular dungeons, but it kind of sets up a separate criteria for final dungeons for me, because a lot of times regular dungeons don't have that aspect of completely testing everything you've learned in the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Especially moving forward, a lot of dungeons will be their own little microcosms, like their own little...
I see, yeah.
Where it's like you get, especially, moving on, we'll see that moving on into Link's Awakening, where it's like, okay, this dungeon is very heavily based on this item, and you need to use this item to unlock certain locked doors and pathways and stuff to get through, and it's very that's really cool in itself too. But this dungeon, as a final dungeon, it does that thing that I really, really want in all final dungeons, which is that it throws everything in there from the rest of the game, and it just tests your merit as a player, as opposed to just being an unearned, really cool cinematic ending.
I totally agree with you. See, I've always had like, I'm known to have like the intro dungeon bias.
Yeah.
And it's because, kind of like we were talking about with this final dungeon, because I'm sort of also kind of appreciating them for like where they are in the context of the game, So like if an intro dungeon does a good job of either like setting the tone or like even teaching you how to play the game. Like I was watching my niece play Ocarina of Time. I gave her my 3DS, and she's doesn't have a lot of video game experience. She's a little kid, but like I was seeing things in like the Great Deku Tree that I didn't even realize were like tutorial elements, because I'm just so used to playing video games.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I have this sort of appreciation that's like in the context of the game, like what it's doing at that point of the game.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
That plays a huge factor, and that's why it really is like the exact same thing. You have the early dungeon bias, just like I have the final dungeon bias, and it's for the exact same reason. It's because it has, being in the spot where it's in, it has an opportunity to do something that other dungeons in the game don't have the opportunity to do.
That's why I guess I didn't totally have the final dungeon bias until doing these last couple games, but especially this game, like 100%, especially this game, was because like, a lot of the other dungeons, I don't think are, I mean, they're all cool and stuff, but they aren't this final like big challenge. Yeah. They are more of a romp,
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, for me, I'm obviously gonna put it at the top, and I think yeah, I think the final dungeon, it should be the best dungeon in the game. It should be.
Yeah.
It's not always going to be, but it should be. And I think this is a perfect example of that.
Oh yeah.
Whew.
We did it.
Yeah, we did it. A Link to the Past stays winning. So, yeah, of course, thanks for joining me again.
Of course.
I'm excited to go through Link's Awakening, because I think now we're probably gonna see things slotting more in between, don't you think?
Yeah, that's what we were talking about this a little while ago, and I think it is. I don't like to see that A Link to the Past on my list literally just sits on top of my previous list.
Yeah.
But I honestly think this is the only time during this whole ranking journey where this is going to happen, I think. From this point out, I think every dungeon that we come upon will really intermingle with the rest of my list, especially with I do have a feeling that Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 are probably going to hold their spot at the bottom. But
yeah,
from this point forward, I feel like there's definitely going to be a pretty good mix, because I have multiple different reasons to like or dislike a lot of dungeons moving forward.
We've laid the foundation, I think.
Oh yeah.
For Zelda. Actually, that's the thing I was noticing a lot, was a lot of A Link to the Past. There was a lot of ways where I was surprised that I was like, oh, this element is just The Legend of Zelda remade.
Yeah.
On SNES, and then we'll see that with like Ocarina of Time, where they do that again.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I think we've laid kind of the base for the Zelda series. I think Link's Awakening will set even more in stone. And then, but it's going to be, like, again, it's going to be similar stuff mixed in. Yep. And I think with Ocarina of Time, it'll also be, we're going to see a lot of similarities between the dungeons in this and Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. So I think Ocarina of Time will have a lot of very high dungeons, but I'm just predicting the next two games. I think, like you said, I think they'll slot in the middle there some more, or like, intermingle.
Yeah, well, just in like each game, each time I've been on this podcast of yours, it's kind of like we review the game in its entirety and its dungeons and kind of what they did for the series. We're getting to the point where, like you said, like the foundation has been laid. There's not going to be any, well, there will be some, but there's not going to be any huge game-changing jumping off points from here on out, I think. A Link to the Past really laid the foundation for what dungeons can be, in the sense that they can have their own different themes. They can be places in the world. They can have their own different, progression and exploration styles. They can have their own different lore and stuff like that. And then the next step is Link's Awakening is going to introduce, this is really how dungeon items can inform your exploration and inform how you progress through a dungeon. And from that point on, we're just gonna see a big mix of that, and that to different levels, if you know what I mean.
Hell yeah, yeah. That's what I mean, I'm not saying I love my series, but what I love about doing the series is, because I just love getting the sort of the historical perspective of it, or you know what I mean? Like, even like when we were looking back at The Legend of Zelda and you see something cool, it's like so exciting,
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
Oh my God.
It's like this is the early DNA. It's like you're looking back at like some sort of ancestral lineage, and you're like, whoa, it all started from here.
Like, yeah, it's because I'm both like putting myself in the mindset of like, okay, it's 1991, I'm playing A Link to the Past, and like, look at this new thing. And so I'm like both appreciating it for like doing something cool and new, unique, and like I've never seen it before, but then at the same time I'm also thinking about how cool, like, we spent so much time in this talking about, Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker and stuff like that, because it also comes back so much. So Very cool.
Definitely.
So yeah, once again, Corey, thanks for coming. Is there, I mean, do you want to plug your podcast or anything else like that?
Yeah, sure. You can. My podcast is called the Player Power Podcast. It's a podcast about video games I host with my friend Ryan. You can find that basically wherever you listen to podcasts. It's on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, all that good stuff. You can follow us at Player Power Pod on Twitter. We do some fun stuff on there. And then you can follow me at Corey Richmond on Twitter.
Is there anything you guys are planning that you wanna tease, or will anything be out by this episode?
Probably, depending on when this comes out, we might have one more episode out, but we're getting towards the end of our first season, and at the end of our first season, we're going to do the conclusion of one of our segments called the homework game, where Ryan and I assigned each other games to play in between recording sessions, and at the end, we're basically going to do like a full-blown review, retrospective type episode on the two games that we had assigned each other.
Oh, is it two games in one episode?
I think so, yeah.
That's sweet. Double review of two very different games.
Oh yeah, big time.
Is Hollow Knight and Final Fantasy Tactics?
Yeah, Hollow Knight and Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions.
Both very sick games, so
yes,
I'm sure there's someone out there who would be interested in that, of course. Yeah, it's a good show. I've been on there a couple times too, so if you like this dynamic, just wait till you hear a third person thrown in.
Exactly.
It's crazy.
Exactly.
Every time I've been on there, we talk about Zelda, and we also rank stuff, so
and if you
like hearing us rank Zelda,
and if you start listening, you know, I can promise Goo's gonna definitely be on more episodes.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah,
there's so many ideas we've talked about that it's so fun to do.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to do it again. All right, so yeah, thanks again, Corey, and thanks to everyone for listening. If I'm sure I might have already started doing this by the time that this video comes out, but I was sort of considering live streaming my dungeon playthrough sessions for Link's Awakening. Because why not? Because they're nice little bite-sized chunks, and I already know the game so well. So if you wanna check that out, I might already be doing it, but go over to twitch.tv/gooeyfame.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I definitely want to watch that.
Yeah, I think it'd be a cool hangout. Maybe I'll probably try to post it so everyone can see it before this video comes out. But yeah, go check and see if I actually ended up doing that. Otherwise, if you're listening to this at release, we'll see you next week for Link's Awakening.